When I was 10 years old, I got lost in New York City. My 12-year-old cousin and I, we loved model trains. And there was a hobby shop in Lower Manhattan that was like model train heaven to us. And our parents had taken us there a few times, but this time we wanted to go by ourselves. My cousin Robert, 12, and I, 10. And here's the difference between the world that I grew up in and the world that our children and grandchildren are growing up in. Our parents let us go. We walked 2 miles to the Staten Island Transit. We got on the train, just the two of us. We took the train from Eltingville to St. George Station, got off the train, paid our 5 cents, got on the ferry, the Staten Island ferry, went across the ferry, got off the ferry, and there we were in Manhattan. And suddenly, my 10-year-old self realized how far away I was from home. So I said to Robert, I want to go home. He said, I want to stay. I said, I'm going home. He said, I'm staying. So we parted company in the ferry terminal, and here's where things really started to fall apart. So this is one of the stories that gets passed down from one generation to the next in the Barber family. So I began to worry about Robert being alone in Manhattan. And he began to worry about me going home by myself on the ferry. So he got on the first ferry to go back home, and I stayed in the ferry terminal looking for him. And I can remember standing at the bottom of an escalator, and every single person coming down that escalator at first looked like my cousin, but wasn't. So, in the meantime, Robert takes the ferry back to Staten Island. He gets back on the Staten Island Transit Railroad. He goes from St. George Station to Eltingville Station. He gets off the train. He walks 2 miles back to my house. He walks in through the back door. My mom and my aunt are having a cup of coffee together. They look at him and say, "Where's Richard?" And he said, "I don't know." I want you to relate the panic that my mom and my aunt felt at that moment to what Mary and Joseph felt when they realized that Jesus wasn't with them. The Revised Standard translates this sentence, when his parents saw him, they were astonished. That doesn't begin to get at the original language here and their emotional state. For 3 days they were tortured by their anxiety, would be a better translation. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this?" Really it means, how in the world could you do something like this to us? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Another not great translation of the original language. Anxiously searching in the original language has the sense of having your insides ripped out of your body. That's how upset they were. So briefly, there are 3 lessons I'd like to draw out of this story for us. And the first one is about leaving Jesus behind. We can't be too hard on these young parents, Mary and Joseph, and we can't project our 21st century anxiety and circumstance back onto them. The annual pilgrimage to the temple was an extended family affair. Aunts and uncles and cousins and neighbors all traveling together. So Mary and Joseph, very understandably, did not have any worries about Jesus at first, thinking that he was with a group of his friends or some relatives. And we have to remember where they're going now. They are going back home from the festival, a yearly festival. And they were going back to their daily lives. Mary may have had some housework she had to catch up on. Joseph, maybe some wood project that he wanted to finish. The festival was over. The Passover wouldn't come again for another year. Wait a minute. Now, that sounds a little bit like us. The festival is over. Christmas won't come again for another year. Some of us are back to work. Others of us are going back to school. Where's Jesus? Are we taking Jesus with us? Jesus right now is where Jesus has always been. He's with and about the business of his Father. What's our business now? Is it our own business? Is it the business of the Father? Finding Jesus is the second lesson from this story. So think about it. Where did his parents ultimately find Jesus? They found Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem, in the Father's house. And the difference between Mary and Joseph's hysterical response and Jesus, 12 years old, very nonchalant, very matter of fact, just off the cuff. They're out of breath with grief and fear. And Jesus, 12 years old, said, "Well, where'd you expect me to be?" Another translation issue. "In my Father's house" is really not the best translation here. In the original language, what Jesus says is, "Did you not know that I had to be about the things of my Father?" The things of my Father. So it's not about the temple as a structure. It's about what that temple symbolizes and means for the life of Israel. It's what's going on, or should go on the inside. The true and proper worship of God. It's about the priorities of the kingdom. So I think as we begin a new year together, it's important for us to think about those things of the Father. And I don't think anyone recently has described the things of the Father better than Rick Warren, Pastor Rick Warren, in that book, A Purpose-Driven Life. Maybe some of you have read it, but he says we were created for 5 purposes. And the first one, he says, is that we were planned for God's pleasure. We were created to worship God. Our lives begin and end with worship. And Jesus' parents found Jesus in the place of worship, sitting in the temple, talking with the rabbis of the day. And we will find Jesus as well in this temple as we sit together and study together and worship together. Pastor Warren says we were formed for God's family, and the entire Bible is this story of how God is forming a family to love God and honor God and serve God. And I promise you, you will find Jesus in this family this year here at Christ the King Lutheran Church. We were created, Pastor Warren says, we were created to become like Christ. And I had a seminary professor who loved to say this: we are Christ's, with and without the apostrophe. We're Christ with the apostrophe because we belong to Christ. And we're Christ without the apostrophe because, as Luther said, we are to become little Christs to our neighbors. Pastor Warren says we're shaped to serve God. And the best way to find Jesus, according to Jesus, is to serve in his name, to give your life away in the service of others. And finally, Pastor Warren says we're made for a mission. And our mission in life is to share the good news of Jesus, and whenever necessary, to use words. And here's the last lesson from the story. It's in the final verses. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But Mary treasured all these things in her heart. And as Jesus grew up, he increased in wisdom and favor with God and people. Now, this is the second time that Luke tells us that Mary treasured these things in her heart. The first time was when the shepherds announced what the angels had told them, that Jesus, the Savior of the world, was born. And everybody wondered, all the people who heard what the shepherds were saying wondered at what they were being told. But Mary, Luke says, pondered all of these things and kept them in her heart. And then on the 8th day, when these young parents bring their newborn son into the temple for the rite of dedication, Simeon, waiting for the consolation of Israel, sweeps the child up in his arms, and here's what he sings. This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. And I just imagine him at that moment turning and looking directly at Mary, and what does he say? And a sword will pierce your heart as well. I don't think it's a coincidence that it took 3 days for Mary and Joseph to find their son. I believe those 3 days are a foreshadowing of another 3 days, a much more important period, when Mary's heart at the beginning of those 3 days would be torn and broken. And then at the end of those 3 days would be put back in a way that she could never have possibly imagined. And so that's what it means, I think, to grow in the wisdom and favor with God and people. To know that what is impossible for humans is always, always possible with God. And that out of Jesus' death is the promise of everlasting and new life. So I won't leave you hanging. I waited for my cousin for hours in that ferry terminal. And at one point, I thought about calling my parents on the telephone. I knew my phone number. I had some spare change. And there were some payphones in the ferry terminal. For those of you who are under 30, ask someone over 30 what a payphone is. But I was 10 years old smart. And being 10 years old smart, I knew that between me and my parents' house was a lot of water. And I knew that in order for phone lines to work, they need to be supported by telephone poles. And I knew that you could not float telephone poles on water. So I didn't call my parents because I knew that that phone call would not work. I would lose my dime because there's no way for phones to travel over water. I became too frightened there, so I got on the ferry reluctantly. And I got back to the ferry terminal in Staten Island. And almost immediately, an officer came up to me and said, "Are you the little boy that's lost?" And I burst into tears. I was certain that I'd never see my cousin again. He was lost forever in New York City somewhere. Don't do with Jesus what my cousin and I did to each other this year. Don't leave him behind. In the new year, take Jesus wherever you go.